For 5 years, the PS5 has been one of the most locked down consoles ever made. But last week, a security researcher quietly dropped on GitHub, or at least not so quietly now, a tool that can turn a launch-era PS5 into a full-tilt Ubuntu PC running Steam games like GTA 5 at 1440 60 FPS with ray tracing and emulating Switch and PS3, and yeah, this unlocks a whole can of worms, so let's get into it. Real quick, if you're new here, hey, I'm Coulter, and on this channel we cover console modding, weird PC builds, and other generally janky tech mods. So if that sounds like you, be sure to subscribe down below so you don't miss future videos. Okay, so the timing of this announcement is pretty hilarious because I personally just bought a PS5 on Marketplace. I've never owned one before, with the intention of never updating it and tucking it away in a closet so that it will eventually have an exploitable firmware. The PS5 modding scene has been making slow but real progress for a few years, and I figured there's probably some cool stuff on the horizon for the PS5, and cut to last week, security researcher Andy Nugent, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, known online as the Flow Zero, the same guy responsible for half of the Vita and PS4 exploits, dropped a public release on GitHub called the PS5 Linux Loader. And it's not a, hey look, we got Hello World running. It's a full toolchain that boots the complete Ubuntu desktop on an actual PS5 with full access to all 8 CPU cores at 3.5 GHz and the GPU at 2.23 GHz. So yeah, it's kind of a big deal. So today we're gonna break down exactly what the Flow's PS5 Linux Loader can do, what hardware it needs, what firmware versions are supported, which is very critical, and take a look at some of the cool stuff people have been doing with this already. So what is the PS5 Linux Loader actually doing? Well, at a high level, the Flow chained 2 exploits. The first is the UMTX2 jailbreak, which is the entry point that gets initial code execution on the system. The second is a hypervisor vulnerability that Sony has since patched on newer firmwares, but that hypervisor exploit is very critical as it lets us bypass write protection, which means we can install homebrew patches or boot custom code at the kernel level, which is where all the power is. When you're booting a full other OS, you want to be at the kernel level if you can. So the translation of all that nerd speak is this is a real full-blown Linux operating system running on a real PS5 console. Not Moonlight streaming, not remote play hack, not a sandbox environment that has less access to CPU and GPU resources. This is full tilt Linux, which if you remember, Sony actually let you install other OSs back on the PS3 back before they killed that feature. And so this is kind of a nice rebirth of that feature, but on a much more capable console. But one important thing up front, this is a soft mod, not a permanent install. So every time you fully power down your PS5, you'll have to rerun the exploit chain to boot back into Linux, similar to the PS4 exploits we covered in my PS4 jailbreak video. Check that out if you missed it. But here's the big caveat. Before you go pulling your PS5 out of the entertainment center or a closet or wherever you have it hiding, with the dream of playing Cyberpunk on Linux tonight, you'll need to check your firmware because the supported firmware window is extremely narrow. Per the Flow's official GitHub, the PS5 Linux Loader supports the firmwares 3.0, 3.10, 2021, 4.0, 4.01, 0.03, 0.5, and 0.51. And that's it. Those are the discrete versions. If your PS5 is like a 4.04 or a 5.0 or anything above 4.51, you're out of the club, at least for now, unfortunately. And I'm very much out of that club as I'm on like version 26 point something or whatever because I only bought it in like February. On top of that, there are 2 more catches. First, this only works on original PS5 Fat models. Not the Slim, not the Pro, which shouldn't be too surprising as I don't think either of those shipped with firmware as old as 3 or 4.0. And another catch, and this is important, if you're on a 3. whatever firmware, you can run Linux straight from a USB drive, but if you're on a 4. something firmware, you actually need a PS5 compatible M.2 SSD installed in the system to boot Linux. Why exactly that distinction exists? I'm not 100% sure. That's something I'd love an explanation, so if you know, feel free to drop that in the comments, but it's an actual hardware requirement of the setup for some reason. Now, of course, firmwares newer than these, Sony has patched out these vulnerabilities because obviously they want to control the experience, but in firmwares older than 3 or 4. whatever, the Flow said in the FAQ that 1. and 2. firmwares might eventually get support, but it's not a priority. However, 5.0 firmwares could potentially work down the road, but Linux would have to run inside Sony's Game OS virtual machine instead of on bare metal, which would mean significantly reduced performance and a bunch of unknown limitations, and of course anything 6.0 or higher is just ruled out entirely right now. But if you have passed that gauntlet of requirements, then here's what you need to get this working on your PS5, perhaps today. You'll need a USB drive with at least 64 gigs of storage, and the Flow strongly recommends an external SSD over a thumb drive because the OS will be running off of it. Similar to on the PS4, we want to actually set ourselves up for success and a nice experience when we play with these things. And also, hot tip, you're going to want to use the ports on the back of the PS5, not the front. The front are USB 2.0 speeds, and that will obviously hamper our performance. You also need a USB Ethernet or USB Wi-Fi adapter. This is one of those friction points that's not obvious because the PS5 has Wi-Fi, but it doesn't have a Linux driver yet. So if you want internet, you gotta bring your own. You'll need a USB keyboard and mouse because you're obviously going to be using a Linux computer now, so you need peripherals for this PC. And then optionally an M.2 SSD that's compatible with PS5 if you want to boot from the internal storage. And like I said, it's required if you're on 4.something firmware. And optionally, you want to bring a Bluetooth dongle if you want to use your DualShock controller wirelessly, because yet again, driver stuff. To do the install, you just clone the Flows repo, run a build script that pulls down a fresh Ubuntu image and bakes it into a bootable USB image, flash it to a USB drive using the Raspberry Pi image writer or DD or whatever. Then on the PS5 side, you actually set up a fake DNS server on a PC on the same network. Then the exploit works by redirecting the PS5's manuals page link to your local server, which triggers the UMTX2 WebKit chain. And then once that exploit lands, you send the PS5 Linux loader payload over TCP on port 9021, which will then cause the PS5 to take a nap into rest mode, and that's where things get really fun. The LED will start dancing around as it's doing stuff, and then following the timing guidelines on the GitHub, you'll press the power button at just the right moment, and if you whack that mole at the right time, then congratulations, you've got Ubuntu running on your PlayStation 5, which is super sick. Also, according to the documentation, if you go through all that and you end up with a white LED and a black screen, most likely the culprit is HDMI compatibility, and the Flow specifically calls out that some monitors don't play nice with the PS5's HDMI signal at 1440p or 4K, so the fallback is to drop to 1080p and see if that works. Before we hop into the performance testing, if you watch this far and you're enjoying the video, or the various videos I put out, I would super appreciate if you would consider subscribing to the channel down below. You can go and like and do the other stuff if you want to, but it would super help out the channel and I really appreciate it. Okay, on to performance. So the question everyone's asking, or at least I'm asking kind of always when I'm hacking hardware, is does this turn the PS5 into a Steam machine? And it kinda actually does. In the Flow's headline demo, posted before the public release, he was running Grand Theft Auto 5 Enhanced, the ray tracing version, running at 1440p at 60 FPS native on PS5 Silicon. No streaming, no GameOS sandbox, which makes sense when you remember that the PS5 is a pretty optimized, sick piece of AMD kit with an 8-core, 16-thread Zen 2 chip at 3.5 GHz, with an RDNA 2 GPU, and 16 GB of GDDR6 memory, which is basically that sweet spot of performance to dollar ratio that you would have built back in 2022, but now we can run Steam on it through Proton like a champ. People have been running Cyberpunk and Elden Ring and all those big AAA titles we love to see in our benchmarks, which honestly is a little hard to believe given that the PS5 has been one of the most lockdown consoles ever, and it's also hard to believe that the PS5 has games. But honestly, the part that's really blown up in my Twitter feed isn't necessarily Steam, but Switch emulation. There's a tweet from a user, the WizWiki, that's been making the rounds where they're running Mario Odyssey on their exported PS5 FAT at a locked 60 FPS, but the part that's wild is they show their CPU utilization in the corner, which is only at 9% utilization, and the GPU at 0%. And the frame time is hovering at like 16.7 milliseconds, so the PS5 is basically asleep while it's emulating Switch, which is wild. And it's not just Switch. RPCS3, the PS3 emulator, also runs natively on Linux and benefits from the same hardware horsepower. And so now we finally saw PS3 backwards compatibility on the PS5 with the help of the friendly neighborhood open source community. Not Sony, of course. And from all the demos I've seen, it looks like PS3 runs at pretty much full speed as well, which is awesome. Another little trick worth mentioning is that the Flow shipped a control utility alongside the loader that lets you tweak the CPU and GPU boost clocks on the PS5 from inside Linux, plus adjusting the fan curves and all that good stuff. So if you're a fan of putting Linux where it doesn't belong and overclocking, then your day just got a whole lot better. Although he does warn in the README that you should obviously be very careful when messing with those boost clocks and all that. And if you're gonna play with them, definitely give it an aggressive fan curve to help combat that heat, because we don't want anything burning out in there. Okay, so this is a lot of cool stuff. Are there any catches or downsides to this? And yes and no. Like I mentioned, it's a soft mod exploit, and so it's not a permanent fixture. You have to run the exploit every time you want to boot into Linux on the PS5. And as is usual with PSN exploits, you should definitely not be logging into your PSN account from your Linux PS5. This is now more of a modding console PS5. If you want to go online, you need to have your separate Sony approved PS5. And of course, one big catch is the available firmware versions, but there have been rumors of a 0-day unpatchable thing floating around in the ether for the PS5, so hopefully that scene's about to blow wide open. So here's hoping, and subscribe if you want to catch videos about that, because you better believe I'm gonna hack the crap out of my PS5 when that comes. Honestly, the wildest thing about this news story isn't that you can run Linux on the PS5, it's how good it is. Like, this isn't just a tech demo or, yeah, a little hello world thing. It runs really well. Like, we're talking AAA games, Switch emulation, PS3 emulation. Like, PS3 emulation is like the hardest thing to run on all the other budget emulation stuff that we'll run through on this channel. But now we're actually gonna be benchmarking the jailbroken PS5 against the upcoming Steam machine, because this thing is actually a competitor. That is, of course, as long as the Steam machine is not on Valve Half-Life 3 time. it's on real people time. But I'm curious, what firmware is your PS5 on? Let me know in the comments and what your plans are for it. And are you one of the lucky few who has the golden ticket that can run this thing on there? I would love to hear about your personal experience with it. And I can't tell you what to do, but I would strongly think twice before updating if you are on one of those blessed firmware versions. If you like this video and videos like it, go ahead and drop a little penguin emoji in the comments so I'll keep doing videos like this about shoving Linux in places where it should not be. And like I mentioned earlier, if you didn't catch it before, go ahead and check out my video where I talked about the PS4 jailbreak scene, which has a lot more options and a lot more compatible firmwares. And I even got Linux running on that in the form of CachyOS, which was actually a pretty sick setup. So I'll see you in that video and have a great day.